Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome back to the second lecture. The first lecture in the course Elements of Literature and Creative Communication, we discussed a couple of interesting concepts. So, before we move on to today's lecture, let us have a quick recap of what we did. Okay. We began with an interesting proposition that in this course emphasis would be more on practical aspects. That is the reason why we began with not with theories of literature as such or definitions of literature, but with a practical taste of literature. So, as part of that we began with the story of 17 cows and 3 brothers and how the 3 brothers could not solve the so called puzzle that was left behind by their father and things like that. And after that we had an interesting activity. If you remember, I took you on a date with imagination and most of you did some brilliant stuff. And here we discovered the beauty of language and literature, because language may be limited in terms of either the number of words it has, whereas literature in terms of applications of language, it is very wide and diverse. So, in the activity we also learned how with a limited set of words we can create unlimited sentence structures that are quite aesthetic, elegant and beautiful in their own merit. After that we discussed a short poem by Langston Hughes called Dreams. In fact, I had also told you that the set of words I gave that set of words was from Dreams, and we compared your compositions with Langston Hughes' poem Dreams and how there were interesting similarities, variations and things like that. So, through that activity we can even say that you have become peers of Langston Hughes, a very well known African American writer. How? Because by using the same set of words that he used, you competed with him in a healthy sense, of course, and you shared the same space that he shared, and therefore you became his contemporaries, though he is not in terms of physicality or not in terms of time, but you became contemporaries in a different sense. After this we discussed how literature is a significant expression of humanity, and that is the reason why we have to expose ourselves to this expression of humanity and things like that. And after that we briefly discussed how Kalidasa, one of our ancient and significant poets, defines literature. He defines literature as a combination, as a fusion and also fruition of sound and sense, vak and artha, and how literature or the written word or even the oral word for that matter, it becomes a fusion of sound and sense, vagartha, something like this. So, in this class we are going to discuss relevance of literature, and also we are going to continue understanding literature, the activity that we began in the previous class. Let us continue that in this class as well. So, our central concern for today's class is what is literature. Okay. I consciously do not wish to, or deliberately I do not wish to take you through the etymological roots of the word literature, how it has a Latinate root and then it came to the French and then in English. That is something that you can easily Google out. So, the emphasis on this class, as we have been discussing time and again, is to give you a taste of literature. That is the reason why I do not begin with an external meaning of literature. So, the first thing before we even ask this question, what is literature, we need to understand our own nature. Human beings, we are called Homo sapiens, right? You have heard of this phrase. We are called Homo sapiens. In other words, wise beings, wise humans. Homo sapiens means wise human beings. So, based on this, there are a couple of neological expressions to describe human beings as such, and these are some instances of such expressions. Homo fabulum, based on, of course, the Homo sapien. These are neological modifications. Homo fabulan or Homo neran. It simply means that like Homo sapien is a wise being, Homo fabulan is, or Homo narans is storytelling beings, storytelling human beings, something like this. That is the reason. In fact, this expression shows that how human beings since time immemorial have resorted to narrating stories, and how narrating stories becomes a characteristic feature of Homo sapiens. That is the reason why we can almost call human beings Homo fabulan or Homo naran. Yeah, keeping up with the spirit of the course, we began, if you remember, we began with a short story. Even here, we are going to begin with another very interesting short story. We can call this short story Blind Men, or A Group of Blind Men and an Elephant. This is a very important short story. In fact, this short story plays a major role in the Indian philosophical traditions as well. And if you have read Ramakrishna Paramahamsa's Vachana Veda, you keep reading this short story, and even in the Indian Upanishadic traditions, this short story plays a very important role. You will have heard the story in some form or the other, and the story is also linked to Buddhist traditions. That is why I said that in the diverse Indian philosophical traditions, this story plays quite a significant role. There were a group of blind men who did not know what an elephant was, So, when an elephant was placed before them, or when they were taken to a place where an elephant was, each of them begins touching a particular part of the elephant and starts describing elephant from that particular point. Say for instance, one blind man who touches the trunk describes elephant as, it's just like a thick snake. Another guy who touches the ears says it looks like a fan. And the other guy who is holding the leg of an elephant, he says, no, I would disagree with you. Elephant is like a pillar, it's a solid pillar. And the guy who is holding the trunk, who is just feeling the trunk, he says, no, I do not agree with any of you. Elephant is more like a wall, it's a thick wall. And the guy who is sensing the tail of the elephant, he says, no, it's a very slick rope, something like that. I say this because the concept of literature is something similar. The kind of definitions that we are going to discuss today, they are going to describe literature from a certain vantage grounds. Please remember that no definition or no understanding of literature would be able to give you a comprehensive idea of literature in its singularity. In order to understand literature in its complexity, in its diversity, you need to place together all our understandings of literature, right? And why is it that the story plays an important role in the Indian philosophical traditions? Because this story is used as a kind of an example. It's a fable to describe the concept of God, how our understanding of God, our discourses on God or religion, how they are just fragmentary in nature, and unless we club all these fragmentary understandings, we will not be able to get a complete, or if not complete, at least a comprehensive picture of God. So, I invoke this story because the kind of definitions, the kind of insights we are going to get No insight is going to exhaust the notion of literature. Therefore, we need to club them, and together we need to understand what the concept of literature is. So, probably we might need an entire course, or some writers even say that they need an entire life to understand the concept of literature. So, let us understand this question, what is literature, in that spirit. All right. The concept of literature is, as it is quite evident by now, it is quite amorphous. It is not a concrete definition. Whatever definitions we are going to give, they are quite amorphous, fluid definitions, right. So, like the concept of the world or the concept of the universe, our understanding of literature is constantly evolving and also already evolved. Like the universe, we say, right, the universe is still evolving and already evolved to a certain extent. Literature too is still evolving and already evolved to a certain extent. That is why I call it a fluid construct or an amorphous understanding. All right. Now, what do we call literature, or when do we produce literature? It is said that when we use language most consciously, informed by aesthetic choices, then we arrogate upon ourselves a kind of a literary mode, right, when we use language. In fact, if you remember, the title of the course is Elements of Literature and Creative Communication. So, already many of you will have made some kind of clever connections between the two. Literature is also communication, and communication is also literary in its broadest sense, but only when we mix the spirits of both do we understand the objective of the course, called Elements of Literature and Creative Communication. Okay. And continuing this discussion, we can say that literature is verbal representation, right. When we say verbal representation, it is a representation using words. Literature is a representation using words. What do we represent here? After all, or of course, we represent human life. We have already understood that, right. Literature is a significant expression of humanity. We discussed that in the previous slide. Here, we continue that concept and say that it is a verbal representation of human life in its complexity. Therefore, this is as old as language itself, because ever since human beings began practicing language in a conscious way, the concept of literature began from there itself, because as we discussed in the previous class, literature is also a kind of an application of language, maybe a specialized application. Nevertheless, it is an application of language. That is the reason why we can call literature almost as old as language itself. Well, these days we discuss knowledge production, knowledge dissemination in serious ways and things like that. There are two ways through which we can create knowledge, or we can say there are two routes, there are two paths to creating knowledge. One is the perceptual path or the perceptual route, and the other is the conceptual route. In fact, herein lies the distinction between disciplines such as physics, chemistry, mathematics, and fine arts and subjects in humanities. Remember, most of the disciplines in humanities, they are called intuitive sciences. In fact, humanities is called a discourse in intuitive sciences. Please look at the expression intuitive sciences. We discuss more of it. And before I proceed, please remember, deliberately in this course, I leave certain concepts partially discussed, because my intention is not to exhaust the notion of the concepts that we use in the class. On the other hand, it is to just pique your interest in the concept, so that you can do a little more research on your own and search and then arrive at your understandings, right. So, what is this conceptual route and the perceptual route? See, the conceptual route is you imagine a certain concepts, you imagine, you understand, it is a cognitive intersection. It is a cognitive intersection to knowledge production. You imagine, an idea is something that you imagine, you execute, you think it twice, and then that leads you to understanding something. That is a conceptual route to knowledge making, knowledge production. The other is perceptual route. Perceptual route involves your sensory organs. I see, I use my sensory organs, I see and learn something, I hear and learn something, I touch, I taste, things like that. That is the perceptual route. And here in the perceptual route, emphasis is more on experience as such. It is an experiential understanding as opposed to conceptual understanding. Literature belongs to this category of perceptual route, that is, it basically gives you an experience. Like it is always said, right, the taste of pudding is in eating it, because if you haven't had a taste of pudding, you wouldn't know what a pudding is. Or if you are from South India, let us say obbattu, there is a delicious thing called obbattu. So, if you haven't eaten it, no amount of description would do justice to that delicacy. So, literature is experiential. Unless you experience it, you wouldn't know what is it. That is the reason why I said that literature creates knowledge in a different way, And how does it do that? How does it do that? If the conceptual route resorts to the abstract things, the perceptual route turns it into a concrete object. To make these complex words sound very simple, it is a simple thing. Now, when I say freedom, let us say for instance there is a 5-year guy or a girl who wants to understand the concept of freedom. No amount of explanation would explain, or would be sufficient to make the child understand freedom, right. On the other hand, what you can do, you can show the child a caged bird, and you release the bird from its cage and the bird flies, or you can show it through the picture, or you can make the child read it in a short story and things like that. That is when the child understands it, right. So, more than the concept of freedom, the image of the bird freeing itself from the shackles, from the cages, gives you an idea of freedom, right. So, this is what literature does. It turns the abstract concept into concrete. How does it do that? By appealing to your senses, by making it a part of your experience, everyday experience. I can extend that analogy and give you one more story. Please remember, you will be in for treats. In case stories is what you like, you are in for treats, because the story, in this course we are going to narrate stories after stories after stories after stories, maybe some interesting poems and lines like that. So, you will be in for a treat. The moment, it is a kind of a question that I almost ask my students in one of my introductory classes. When we say the Buddha, what comes to your mind? Most of them, almost without any pause, they say the enlightened one. The Buddha means the enlightened one. I asked them, what is enlightenment? Well, they start scratching their head, well, enlightenment. On the other hand, rather than leaving the Buddha as simply an enlightened one, because if you simply use that phrase enlightened one, we may not be able to understand what that state of enlightenment is, and unless we understand that state of enlightenment, at least partially understand that state of enlightenment, except it does not serve, that epithet enlightenment does not serve any purpose, right? I give them a story. Now imagine a person standing on, let's say, a 7-storied building, right? So there is a mansion, huge mansion with 7 stories. So imagine a person standing on the 7th story. So what happens? The person standing on the 7-storied building can easily watch who is coming in and who is going out, right? Supposing somebody who he doesn't like is trying to enter the house, he can immediately instruct his servant, say the master is not within, please send that person away, because that guest who wants to come in is not a welcome guest. On the other hand, when he is standing on top of the 7 floors, if he sees a person approaching and he wants to meet that person because he is a welcome guest, then he instructs the person below, please open the door, I want to meet him, something like this, right? That is the advantage. Person standing on 7th floor or 7-storied building, that is what he can see, that is the advantage, that is the advantage. So Buddha is also somebody like a person standing on the 7th floor. Well, you might ask, how is it? How are you going to connect the Buddha with the person standing on the 7th floor? Now let us replace the 7-storied building with the 7 layers of consciousness or multiple layers of consciousness. Then Buddha is a person who is standing on top of that. Then what happens? Supposing anger is trying to knock in and enter you, because Buddha is a person standing on the 7 layers, there could be any number of layers of consciousness, we do not know. He can instruct the person, let us say here the intellect or buddhi, say no, anger is not a welcome guest, therefore the intellect shuts the door because the master above has instructed him not to open the door, therefore anger is not welcome. So is hatred. Supposing hatred is trying to knock on your doors and wants to come in, you can similarly close the door. You need not even let hatred enter you. It can make any attempts, but you don't need to yield to those attempts. On the other hand, imagine love is knocking on your door. Love is a welcome guest, isn't it? Don't you want to welcome love? Fine, you ask the intellect to open the door, let that emotion come in, let that feeling come in. Compassion knocks on the door. Compassion, of course, is a welcome guest. You let him in, something like that. When I explain using this story, almost always everybody understands what the state of enlightenment is, If we can understand the story, then we would be able to practice it in our own lives. If not to a complete extent, at least we can begin our journey. We can keep the first step ahead, right? That's the first step. If you understand the story and if you have experienced the spirit behind it, then you have already taken the first step towards becoming the Buddha. Of course, it's quite an arduous journey, but you are always you have started with a bang because you have understood what the journey is all about. You have kept your first step. And now continuing the concept, in literature, I always say this, even in communication too, this is something common between communication and literature. And after all, when we say literature, it's also a form of communication. We have already discussed that. And sometimes even communication we make is also literary. It is capable of being literary in the hands of a competent communicator. Whatever he or she speaks becomes literary, right? That's when it can inspire people. Remember the words of Gandhi or remember the words of Churchill. Now, in communication too, communication is not about what we speak. it is also how we speak, what we speak, right. Similarly, in literature, it is not about content, but what is the structure in which you have placed this content. So, we use in literary jargon, we use a term called form and content, or structure and content, you know. So, how you say something is equally important, if not more, than what is being said. So, both form and content together constitute literature element. So, depending on that structure, literature can be classified into various other categories, you know, that we will discuss in subsequent classes. For time being, what we can know is that literature is not just content, it is also form, all right. So, let us continue this journey and understand what literature is. This is an extraordinary quote by a renowned 19th century French writer called Stendhal. He calls reading, when he says a good book, he means reading a good book or reading a literary piece, literature. A good book is an event in life. He says a good book is an event in my life. What a remarkable statement. You know what an event is, right? So, now compare, introspect how reading a good book is an event in life. I want to leave this discussion incomplete so that you can think and discuss and then come up with your understanding. A good book is an event in life, all right. Continuing the discussion of our understanding of literature, we can say that we can describe literature in many ways. Mahashweta Devi, one of our gifted writers, Bengali writers. We do not need to call our writers Bengali writer, Kannada writer, Hindi writer, Malayalam writer. They are Indian writers basically, but of course, they write in a particular language. Nevertheless, they are Indian writers. So, Mahashweta Devi, also a Gyanpith awardee, she is a Gyanpith laureate, you know that. She describes literature as a celebration of life, as a song of life, because if life were to have an expression, then it would express using literature. That is why it is a celebration of life or a song of life. She also calls it a language of dreams. Let us remember, fables, short stories, novels, poems, they are a sort of uttered dreams, right. When we dream, they are not uttered, but here you can call them manifestation of our dreams or utterances of our dreams. A poem, a fable, a story, a novel, a play, they are all uttered dreams. And therefore, Mahashweta Devi goes on to call that to dream is to be a fundamental right. She gives a clarion call in one of the literary festivals. She says that to dream should be our fundamental right. She accords dreaming the status of a fundamental right. What a lovely insight, right? And I also use another important term, and this term is an important concept in feminism especially, but in most of other activistic theories too. Consciousness raising activity is an important concept, but probably for the first time the second wave of feminists begin using consciousness raising activity as an important measure. What is consciousness raising activity? Well, for them, when you make a person narrate his or her experiences of life, then when a group of people listen to it, it creates an awareness. It is an awareness raising activity. You can also call it an awareness raising activity. Therefore, feminists believe that through these kind of group sessions, by making each other narrate to each other the experiences of their life or the experiences of their oppression, you create a kind of a cathartic effect, and thereby you raise the awareness among people. Literature precisely does that job. That is the reason why I call literature a consciousness raising enterprise. Remember what Franz Kafka, a remarkable novelist, if you have time please read, a brilliant novelist, He says that if the literature we are reading does not wake us, then why do we read it? Because the purpose of literature is to awaken us. Awaken us. A literary work must be an ice axe to break the sea frozen inside us. What a remarkable quotation it is, that literature acts as something that breaks the ice within. Ice here is again metaphoric. Ice is something that prevents, you need a melting of the ice for the free flow of life, right? So literature must create that experience in us. So literature in that sense is also a consciousness raising activity. And before I end this class, I give a very interesting line to my students, and this is something that all of us can think over, right? So this is, we can begin our next class with an interesting discussion of this. Just consider this statement: literature helps me live 1,000 lives within a single life. Literature helps me live 1,000 lives within a single life. Pause for a while. See what the statement is trying to say. Debate with yourself, is it possible to live multiple lives within a single life? If possible, how is it possible? If not possible, why not possible? It's true, human beings, when we say mortals, mortality means we have certain limitations, right? But is it possible to be immortal? Can literature make me immortal? Can it make me live multiple lives, 1,000,000 lives, or 1,000 lives, or 100 lives within a single life? Is it even possible? So think about this, and in the next class we can continue our discussion of literature. So before we go, here is an interesting thing for us to think deeply. Literature helps me live 1,000 lives within a single life. All right. Thank you. See you in the next class.